Alright, we're going to be looking at the quadratic formula. Now the quadratic formula is, you'll notice here, over here we have the quadratic formula. It has an A, a B, and a C. Well, we've been dealing with factoring quadratics and factoring and solving quadratics. And when we're dealing with quadratics, there's an A term in the front, a B term in the middle if it's in standard form, and a C term here at the end. Okay, now the quadratic formula helps us because I have my A term here, 4. Quadratic formula has a place to put the A term. There's a B term here in this one. In this example is 7. The B term goes here and here in the formula, and then we've got our C term, negative 30, and that only goes in there in the equation one time. But there's a place in the quadratic formula for me to put each of these 3 terms. If I'm dealing with a quadratic that's in standard form, there's an A, there's a B, there's a C. We have a place to put that in the quadratic formula. Okay, so now I want to look at this. I want to use this as our example right here. In the quadratic formula, it says negative b. So whatever my b term is, in this case, my b term is 7. When I plug this b term here in positive 7, it's going to change the sign. So this is positive 7. When I plug it into the formula, you'll notice there's a negative in front of the b term. It's just going to change the sign of whatever that b term is. So it's negative 7. And this little plus or minus right here, don't let that throw you off. There is no special key for plus or minus. I have a plus or a minus because what I'm going to do, the first time I enter this in the calculator, I'm going to hit plus because I'm going to get 2 answers here. When you use the quadratic formula, it typically gives you 2 separate answers. Okay. Now, the first time I enter it, I'll hit plus, and then I'll go back and change that to subtract. But I'm going to hit negative 7, negative b, which is 7, plus the square root. And you have a square root key on your calculator. Now, before I enter this, if you were trying to enter this on a Casio calculator, there's a little fraction key. You want to hit this little fraction key first before you start trying to type this in and get your answer. Because what I'm entering right now is in the numerator of a fraction. So make sure you hit that fraction key first. Type all this in the numerator of the fraction. And then I can go down to the denominator and put over 2a. Alright, so I've got negative b plus, and then you'll hit your little square root key. And of course, the square root key looks kind of like this. It's the square root with a little box under it. The square root of b squared. Well, the b term was 7, so I'm going to square that. And then minus 4. 4 is in the formula. The quadratic formula has that 4. You will always have it minus 4. Okay? Times the a term, which in our equation over here, our a term was 4. You'll notice that in the equation I have an a term of 4. I'm plugging that in exactly where it tells me to. And our c term was negative 30 over here, and I'm going to plug that into the formula. It's negative 4 times the a term times the c term. Okay, and everything fits exactly into this formula where there should be an a term, a b term, and a c term. There's a place for it. Then down at the bottom, I'll hit there's arrows on your calculator. It's kind of like a keypad. It tells you up, down, left, right, and all that. I'll drop down into the bottom of this fraction, and I'll put 2 times the a term. And in this example, the a term was 4. Okay, and if I'm in my calculator and I hit enter, it will give me an answer. Okay, now in Algebra 1, if you get an error message, go back and check your signs. Make sure you put the right numbers in. You should not get an error message because we're not going to be dealing with imaginary numbers or any negative square roots. So go back and check that. Make sure that everything works out. Okay, and this will give me an answer. Now, you don't have to retype this twice. Like I said, you're going to get 2 answers, but what you can do is use your little keypad and backspace up. I will backspace and I'll go all the way back until I get to where this plus is, and I'll hit the delete button. You have a delete key on your calculator, and I'll delete the plus and change it to a subtract. And then I'll hit enter again, and it'll give me my second answer, because you're going to get a negative 7 plus the square root of all of this stuff over here. Then I'm going to go back and change it, and I'm going to get negative b minus the square root of all this stuff over here. And that's going to give me my 2 answers. Okay, so my first answer will be negative 7 plus, and then my next answer, I'm going to delete that plus, change it to a subtract, and it will give me the second answer. So you're going to get two different solutions here. Alright, I want to look at another example, and here is one where the a term kind of looks like it's missing, but the a term here, if you don't see a number in the front of x, you can put a 1 there. It's implied that a equals 1. Then my b term here is positive 5, so my b term is 5, and the c term here is 6. So I've figured out what the three coefficients are, what the numbers are, that I'm going to plug in to this formula. Okay, and in the quadratic formula, it tells me to plug in the b term here. So my b term is going to be plugged in here and here. So I've got negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared minus 4, and that 4 is a part of the formula, times the a term, which in this specific example is a 1, times the c term, which is 6. All this is going to be over 2 times the a term, and again the a term is just 1. So if you're putting this in your calculator, just make sure that that's plus the first time, and then I can go back and I can change that to a subtract just by backing up and changing it to subtract. So if there's not a number in front of x, in our first example there was a number in front of x, in this one there's not a coefficient. It's always implied that there's a 1 there, and it's the same thing if the b term had just been x. I'd put a 1 there in place of the b term. Okay, so plug those numbers in to the equation exactly as they are, and when you hit enter, it'll give you an answer in your calculator. Just back up, change that to subtract, hit enter again, and it will give you a second answer. Okay, and I want to look at an example where maybe a term is missing from the original quadratic, and I want to show you what that's going to look like. Now in this specific example, we have an a term here, so it's easy to see that there's an a term, it's x squared. In this case the a term would be 1 because there's an implied 1 in front of x squared. And there is an obvious b term here, we've got 3 in front of x, but there is no c term in this quadratic equation. There is just an a term and a b term, so what that's going to look like is my c term is going to be 0, and it's important that we understand that if there's not a c term, that 0 is a possible input here. It's something I'm going to plug in. 0 is a value that's necessary here. Don't just leave it blank. Don't just put in the a and the b and then just not put anything for c. If I was going to plug this into the quadratic formula, which I have up here, I've got negative b, there is a b term, and the first time I would hit plus, the square root of b squared, minus 4 times the a term, which is just a 1 here, but when you go to put the c term in, there is 0 there for the c term. There's nothing there, over 2 times a, which is just 1. I'll plug that in again. So when you are dealing with a quadratic and there is nothing for a c term, and the same thing, if there was no b term, I would put a 0 in for b. So it doesn't matter if you're missing a b or a c. Make sure that you don't just put a 1 there, because a lot of people get confused and they go, oh, if there's nothing there I put a 1. That's if there's no coefficient that you can see. But if there's a actual missing term, or there's no b term, or there's no c term, you would put a 0. Okay, I only put a 1 if there is an x squared, there is an a term, there is 1x squared, there is a 3x, but there is no c of any kind. So that's why I need to put that 0 there. Okay, so make sure that if you're using the quadratic formula that you understand that if there is no b term, no c term, that you put a 0 in there, because that's going to impact what your outcome is, what your answer is. And we might also see a quadratic that is not in what we call standard form. And it may look like it's in standard form, but it's not. If it is in standard form, you'll have your a term, ax squared, and then you'll have your b term next to the variable, then you'll have your c term, and that whole thing will say equals 0. Now you'll look at this one, and it almost looks like it's in standard form. You've got your 2x squared, your minus 7x, and then you got a whole number down at the end. But you want to make sure that this equal sign is not in the middle of your quadratic, or it's not in the wrong place. If it is a quadratic equation and I can actually solve this using the quadratic formula, it should say equals 0, and this 3 should not be over here. So what I want to do is I want to get everything to the correct side of the equation before I start trying to plug these numbers in, because you plug in a -3 as your c term, it's not going to give you the right answer. So what I need to do is I need to move this to the other side of the equation, just like when we're solving an equation. If I want to get a -3 to the other side, I have to add, and it's going to move to the other side and become a +3. So my new quadratic would be 2x squared minus 7x, and then I added that 3 to move it over, so it's going to become +3, and there's nothing left on the other side. I've gotten rid of this 3 over here. These would be the values that I'd be plugging into the equation. So if I plug that in, my b term would be -7. Now in your calculator, you can put in a -7 squared, but if you do that in a calculator, make sure you put parentheses around that -7. Otherwise your calculator does it incorrectly and it's going to give you -49. But we kind of know that when we take two negatives and we square them, -7 times -7, two negatives make +49. Your calculator doesn't really do that correctly, because it squares the 7 and then just applies the negative later. So there's two things I can do. I can put in -7 squared in parentheses, or you could just always, when I go to put that b term in, I could just always make it positive. Either way, it's going to give you the same thing. So I've got the b term -7 squared minus 4 times the a term 2 times the c term +3. All of that over 2 times the a term 2. This will work out correctly. If you had used -3, it's going to give you something different. So make sure you put your equation in standard form. Make sure you're paying attention to these signs. And again, signs are important. In the formula, it is -b, plus or minus. Well, you'll notice here this is a -7 I plugged in. Those two negatives in your calculator will recalculate to a +7, because a negative and a negative makes a positive. Whether I'm subtracting a negative or multiplying two negatives, it's going to give me +7. And the calculator will do all this work for you. Just make sure you put the correct information into that formula. Get it in standard form first.